Hello and welcome to Live Mint's YouTube channel. I'm Vivek. Today we will be talking about the union budget, which is scheduled sometime later this month. Now, before we get into the details, it is important to understand as to what exactly is the budget or what exactly is the union budget. So, union budget is essentially a statement of accounts in which the government, the central government, the union government, gives us the details of the spendings that it has planned during the course of a financial year, that is, its expenditure. And it also gives us the details of how it expects to finance this spending, as to how it expects to earn that money to be able to carry out that expenditure. So that's the basic thing about the union budget. Of course, there are a lot of other policy announcements that are also made along with the budget. Now, the thing to remember is that how does the government earn money? The government earns a large amount of its money through raising taxes. So, what are these taxes? So, the first tax is the personal income tax, the income tax that you and I pay on the money that we earn. Then there is the goods and services tax, which we all keep hearing about. Then there is the income tax that corporations pay on the profit that they make. Then there is the excise duty which the government charges on industrial production, or essentially what the companies produce and sell. And then there is import duty on goods and services that are imported into this country. So these are the 5 taxes through which the government primarily earns money. So, you must have heard a lot of people talk about, especially on the social media, that very few Indians pay tax. Now, this is really not true. Very few Indians actually pay income tax. Okay, so an estimate from 2021-22 essentially suggests that around a little over 2 crore people in India pay income tax. But that does not mean that people don't pay tax in India. Let's say you buy a product. Now, into the price of the product, the goods and services tax, the excise duty, and the import duties are built in. So essentially, everyone who is, all of us buy something or the other, and when we buy stuff, we do pay a lot of indirect taxes. Now, given that all of us pay tax, hence any change in the tax structure impacts us. And the change in the tax structure for all taxes except the GST happened during the course of a budget. So, which is why, the budget essentially impacts our daily lives, and which is why it's important for us as citizens and voters to basically have a simple understanding of what the budget stands for. So this was one way the budget impacts us. There is another slightly complicated way through which the budget impacts our daily lives. So, very few governments actually all across the world, almost none, actually earn all the money that they spend. So there is a difference between the total amount of money that a government earns and the total amount of money that it spends. And this difference is technically referred to as the fiscal deficit. So the fiscal deficit is essentially financed by the government by borrowing money. And how do they borrow money? They borrow money by issuing financial securities referred to as government bonds. And these bonds are bought by banks, by mutual funds, by insurance companies. And, in this day and age, even the retail investors can buy this bond directly from the government. So if the fiscal deficit of the government is large, then the government has to borrow more. And if the government borrows more, then there is a lesser amount of money for everyone else to borrow in most situations. Now, this may not be true for specific situations, but largely this is true. So when there is lesser amount of money for everyone else to borrow, because the fiscal deficit of the government is high, so the interest rates tend to go up. And when interest rates go up, you and I pay higher EMIs. So this is another way in which the fiscal deficit of the government and thus its budget can impact our daily lives. Let's take another example. Now that we are talking about how the budget impacts our daily lives. So let's say a government decides to spend more money in a particular year than they were doing in the past or than they had budgeted for. So typically what tends to happen in such a situation is that it leads to higher inflation or a higher rate of price rise. So something like this, if I remember correctly, had happened in 2008, 2009, when during the course of the year, the government decided to spend a lot more money than it had originally budgeted for. And that continued over the next few years, and that essentially led to double-digit inflation. So for those of us who are old enough, we would remember that from 2010 onwards, inflation was in double digits. That is, it was higher than 10%. So this is another way in which the government's budget impacts our daily lives. So let's start this section with a small analogy. We are shooting this in the Lower Parel area of Mumbai. I'm sitting in a building on the 9th floor. And if you were to sort of look out of this building at this point of time, you'll realize how beautiful Mumbai looks in long shot. And, the rain is in the air and it's just beautiful. There is greenery all around. It's only when you step out of the building and try walking in the rain do you realize that there are puddles of water all around, the roads are broken, and it's very difficult to find a cab. So when you sort of step out of the long shot, you realize that life is not as beautiful as it looks from the 9th floor on a rainy evening. This is an analogy, I think, which applies very well to the Indian economy right now. And how is that? So in 2023-24, the economic growth, or what is technically referred to as the GDP growth, with GDP standing for Gross Domestic Product, which is a measure of any economy, measure of the size of any economy. So the GDP growth in 2023-24 stood at 8.2%, adjusted for inflation, which is a pretty good figure. But if you look at private consumption expenditure, which is essentially a sophisticated way of referring to the money that you and I spend on buying things, the goods and services that we buy, the private consumption expenditure, which also is the largest part of the Indian economy, it forms close to 55 to 60% of the Indian economy, it grew by just 4%, which is half the GDP growth. And more importantly, it's the slowest growth in private consumption since 2002-2003. So that's more than 20 years back, when the consumption growth had grown by around 2.9%. Of course, this is if we ignore the pandemic year of 2020-21, where the private consumption had actually contracted. One step that is being talked about extensively in the media is that the government is planning to cut income tax rates. Or even if it doesn't cut income tax rates, it's probably looking at increasing tax slabs so that people pay a lesser amount of income tax. In the process, they have more money in their hands, which they are likely to spend. Now, one problem with this argument, which is often offered, especially on the social media, is that very few Indians actually pay income tax. And as I said earlier in the piece, the number is a little over 2 crores. At least in 2021-22, it was that. The number might be a little more than that, probably 2.5 crore now, but definitely lesser than 3 crore. So, if only 2 to 3 crore Indians actually pay income tax, then cutting income tax in a way doesn't make cutting income tax outflow in a way doesn't make much sense, because not many people are likely to go out there and spend that money. While this sounds true, but there is a certain nuance to it which is important to understand. And what is that nuance? Now, the nuance is that in most Indian households, only one individual tends to pay income tax. So, if income tax is cut, it is essentially not just that individual, but the entire household which benefits. So, if we look at it from the point of view of households, and given that an average Indian household has around 5 people, so the spending ability of more than, many more than 2 crore people is likely to go up if income tax rates are cut. One thing that definitely needs to be done is that the central government taxes that are built into the price of petrol and diesel, which is essentially excise duty and other surcharges, need to be cut. This is the easiest way of putting more money in the hands of people in the quickest possible manner. The government is in a position to do this because this year they have received a large surplus from the RBI, which is over 2 lakh crore in comparison to around 87,000 crores last year. The other thing that the government definitely needs to look at is to cut the goods and services tax that it charges on two-wheelers, which is currently at 28%, and I think it should be reduced to around 18%. So once two-wheeler sales pick up, so these sectors which feed into the two-wheeler sector will also do well. So I think, the multiplier effect will be pretty good, and this is one thing that the government definitely needs to look at in the budget. I think the first thing they're looking at is the fiscal deficit of the government. The fiscal deficit of the government has shot up in the post-COVID years. In 2023-24, it was at around 5.6% of the GDP, and the stock market obviously is hoping that the government will continue to lower the fiscal deficit. But data also shows that many more retail investors in India are now trading in financial derivatives than they did in the past. Now, a lot of people, in fact, almost all of all these individuals, when they get into financial derivatives, they think that they are going to make money and they're going to make a lot of money quickly. But the data doesn't really show us that. The data from the Securities and Exchange Board of India, which is India's stock market and mutual fund regulator, tells us that 90% of people who invest in financial derivatives end up losing money. So it is not surprising that the regulators and the government both are worried about this, and it is likely that measures will be introduced in the budget which will make the trading of financial derivatives more expensive than was the case in the past, in order to discourage so many retail investors investing in financial derivatives. So this is something the stock market is closely looking at, because stock brokerages have made a lot of money in the last few years through this route. Now, over the years, the interest that is paid on a home loan home loans up to the extent of rupees 2 lakh can be deducted while calculating the taxable income. Now, the real estate industry, the real estate consultants, the real estate associations have been demanding over the last few years that this limit of 2 lakhs needs to go up. And I think it is fair only because the prices of real estate have really gone up over the last few years. And hence, I think that at least for someone who's buying a house for the first time, a deduction of up to rupees 3 lakh needs to be allowed. So I hope the finance minister is considering something along these lines. This limit has been at rupees 1.5 lakh, 150,000 rupees for many years. Whereas, the inflation has really gone up during that period. Hence, I think it's time now that the 1,50,000 limit needs to go up. Ideally, this limit should just be linked to the rate of inflation, and it should be allowed to go up automatically every year. There is no reason for the finance minister to have to announce every time she wants to make a change to this limit. So I hope something along these lines also happens.